Thank you.
Okay, we're going to call our meeting to order. It is 6:03, and I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I would like everyone to have a look at the agenda, hoping you've been able to see it and go through it. Would anybody like to move the approval of the agenda? I'm gonna have to ask you not to share the screen so I can see. Ah, perfect, thanks. Okay, would someone like to move the approval of the agenda? Moved by Stephen, seconded by Derek. Agenda approved. Any changes? Sorry, any changes or deletions, additions? Not hearing any changes. All in favor of the approval of the agenda? Contrary minded? Agenda approved. Number 4, Planning Advisory Committee, May 19th meeting minutes weren't ready for tonight's meeting, but they will be ready for our next meeting, I understand. Correct? Dawn's nodding her head yes.
Correct, yeah.
Number 5 on our agenda, business arising from the minutes and any unfinished business. Not having the minutes, Dawn, is there anything there that stands out that we need to be aware of?
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay, thank you. Number 6 on the agenda, our public information will begin. So we're going to be looking at our new draft planning documents for the municipal planning strategy, the land use bylaw, subdivision bylaw with specifications. And I'm going to turn this over to Dawn and to Uplands Planning.
There we go. I'm hoping you can see my screen okay. Okay. I can't see you, so I'm hoping that's okay. Heather, if it's not, just text me. So this is a public information meeting for the draft planning documents. These are our Planning Advisory Committee members, Chair Susan Sanford, Derek Kinsman, Councillor Halverson, Jerry Ralston. Oh, Jack is no longer a member. Peter Goforth, Councillor Ernst, and Mayor as ex officio. So we have advertised this public information meeting. I'm just going to take a minute and talk about what we've done already. So back in April, we stuffed 1,600 envelopes for the light bills. We had information of all the engagement activities that were going on in May. So we sent that out the 1st of May with your light bills. We did advertise our open public forum that was held earlier this month. We advertised the online draft release. We put a copy of the draft at the library. PAC also held the open public forum on the 13th, and they reviewed the public feedback from that on the 19th. We mailed out letters to 1,084 homeowners, or I shouldn't say home, property owners in the town, telling them about this public information meeting. And we also have it in, have all the engagement activities in the council, the tentative council dates for June and July in the light bills for this month coming, so June. And right now what we have advertised is our public information meeting. So this, and this also went out to every assessed owner in the town of Lunenburg. So the process, I'm just going to take a minute and talk about the process for the planning documents approval. So we have two processes we have to follow in the whole process. We have our public participation process. It's a program under the MGA that the town has to follow. And then Municipal Government Act has a process for adoption as well. So from Project Lunenburg, these are all tentative dates on the screen there. PAC reviewed the draft, the online draft that was out May 8th, and had a public forum, and they looked at the feedback last week. Now tonight we're having a PIM. We're also going to talk a little bit about having an extra PIM next week on June 2nd. So there's going to be two public information meetings next week. And also next week, PAC is set to consider the documents and make a recommendation to council. Again, these are all tentatives. We'll go forward to council for first reading, which is basically a formality. They will set the public hearing date at that time. We'll send out our letters again. It'll be advertised twice. And we're hoping to have a public hearing on July 27th. And council will give a second reading and approval that night. Doesn't have to be that night. It's perfectly within council's purview to defer it to the next council meeting. That's fine. So by the end of August, we have to send 4 copies of the certified documents off to the province for review. And these will be reviewed. They will impact the provincial interest statement. So they will be reviewed. Review of compliance and consistency with the MGA, Municipal Government Act, and also the statements of provincial interest, such as drinking water. After that, we will get a letter back saying, the documents are fine as they are, or you need to change this because it doesn't impact, or it has an impact on the interest statement, or it doesn't comply with a section of the MGA, highly unlikely. And after that, we will advertise it in the paper, and then our new planning documents will be in effect. So it's a fairly set out process. You can't really deviate from it too much. The only thing you can deviate from really is timing. And we've been at this for over 2 years. So you see the end in sight in November, which would be great. So public information meeting provides members of the public an opportunity to learn about a proposal, or in this case, our new planning documents, and make their views known to the Planning Advisory Committee. And again, this is required under the public participation program. It's a process that we have. So the Planning Advisory Committee may make a recommendation to council or defer a decision if they need more information or changes, mostly like through a development agreement or a land use bylaw text. This would mostly apply. Note that there's time for questions from the audience, and we're going to do that through a Q&A with Upland. And once the meeting is closed, discussion is between committee members. And again, after the public information meetings are finished and PAC makes a recommendation to council, there'll also be a public hearing, which will be very similar to this, where your views can be known as well. And you can email your comments in for public hearing, or you can attend and speak. Anybody can speak and is encouraged to. General rules of conduct, to state your name and civic address so that it can be recorded in the minutes. And we ask that you're respectful of others' opinions. And speakers are limited to 1 presentation, usually about 5 minutes, unless called upon by the chair for further comment. And speakers are limited so that everyone has an opportunity to participate. We know that PAC members can question each speaker or Upland here, and comments and questions by the public are to be directed to the chair. And if you are having trouble, you could call or text Heather McCollum, 902-523-1670. Okay, so this is what the format of our information meeting. There's going to be a presentation by Upland, and those are our planning consultants. And any written submissions, they have already gone to hello at Project Lunenburg, or if they've come to me or the mayor, they've been forwarded to Upland. And the public input session will also be the Q&A. And just another note that we are going to have an additional public information meeting next Wednesday, same time. Okay, and that is it for me. I'm gonna stop sharing and try. There we go. Okay, we'll send it over to Upland for their presentation.
That should be sharing from my screen, yes? Yep.
Yeah, it's good.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ian Watson. I'm a senior planner with Upland, and with me is Stefan. You want to introduce yourself, Stefan?
Sure. I'm a partner with Upland, and we've been working together on Project Lunenburg for over 2 years now.
Yeah.
Very excited to be back here with our revisions today.
So this is the public I guess, first of two public information meetings, and we're going to go through what's in the draft documents. And for those of you who attended the public open house, I guess a week previous, a lot of this will be a repetition, so you'll really get to know it. And then kind of at the end of the presentation, we'll go through highlighting the changes that we've made since the last draft to the draft for today. So as a context of where we got, or how we got here today, as you're very likely aware, over the past 2 years, the town, along with Upland, we've been working on a really exciting project, kind of unique in Nova Scotia, which was to develop a comprehensive community plan, which was a plan for not just land use and development, but kind of all aspects of town life and municipal operations, town operations. So that was a really exciting process, and the final document for that comprehensive community plan was adopted in November, I believe, and is now in effect. And so that comprehensive community plan has a whole list of strategic actions, a lot of background context as well, and then a whole list of strategic actions, looking forward to the next 40 years in Lunenburg. And some of those strategic actions, well, a lot of them deal with land use and development and the way we physically shape our community, the roads, the buildings, the services in the ground. So one of the major implementing tools that we're using to implement this comprehensive community plan is the municipal planning strategy, which is the high-level policy document for land use and development in the town. And then out of this, there are two other documents: the land use bylaw, which is the zoning and the regulations for where and what you can develop, and then the subdivision bylaw and its associated specifications, which deal with the process of creating lots and standards for services, things like pipes in the ground and road widths and stuff like that. So these are major implementing tools of the comprehensive community plan, but they aren't the only ones. There's a lot of other actions that deal with programming or budgeting or partnerships. So there are some things, for example, that came up at the comments that were submitted or that came up at the public open house that deal with bigger things than we'll get to in this municipal planning strategy, but that doesn't mean they're missed. They should be there in the comprehensive community plan, and they'll be approached with different tools. Before I move on, there was a question. Oh, yeah. Asking how many attendees. We have 37 right now. Okay, so moving on, what's in these documents? So when we did the comprehensive community plan and the extensive engagement that went into that, and also the background research, there was a number of discussion papers that were done throughout the process. There were a huge range of issues that came up, but a number of them specific to land use that we pulled out as we went back and looked at these documents are things like housing, a working waterfront, sustainable infrastructure, a changing climate, and living heritage. So these are listed in the municipal planning strategy, and kind of the goal of these documents, I think, is any of the policies and the regulations should be helping address those key issues to the extent that we can through land use planning. And again, there's some things like for example, affordable housing programs or whatever it may be that will come through other means rather than the regulatory side of things. So I think it's worth highlighting this because it's a bit of a change in, if you've ever dealt with planning in Nova Scotia, the approach we've taken is a little different. So we think it works. I'm pretty excited about it, but it does require a bit of shift in thinking. So it's worth explaining. So Traditionally in Nova Scotia, when you look at land use planning and development, you'd go to the land use bylaw and you'd look up your property and it would have a zone on it. You know, my house is in the R2 residential zone. And that zone would control the types of uses that are allowed on the land, whether it's restaurants or houses or accommodations or salvage yards or whatever it may be. That zone would also control building form, you know, how tall your building can be, how far it has to be back from the front lot line, all of those things. And that same zone would control lot sizes and lot frontages and the standards that you have for when you create lots. How big does it have to be? All that kinds of things. And the result of this is, you know, often you end up with a lot of exceptions, notwithstanding this, notwithstanding that in the documents, because, you know, things like a restaurant might have different needs than another use, but they're all within the same zone and they have different form needs and all those kinds of things. So it gets, you're kind of stretching a little bit or trying to make all the pieces fit at once. So what we've done, which I think is pretty exciting, is we split that out. So now when you look at a piece of property in the land use bylaw, there are 3 zoning maps. There's a lot zoning map, a use zoning map, and a form zoning map. So we'll go into these in more details, but the lot zoning map controls those standards for creating lots, the uses that are allowed on the land, and then, as you might expect, the form controls what the buildings and lot and, you know, site look like. What this allows is a really clear document structure from a usability point of view. You know, if you're subdividing a piece of land to give a lot to your brother, you go to the lot zoning and you understand exactly, you know, it's a short section. It's pretty clear on what you need your lot to be. Or if you're wondering if you can open a restaurant on this property, you can go right to the use zoning and say, yep, there it is, or no, I can't. And similarly, if you want to put an extension on the back of your house, you go to the form zoning and say, yep, I can fit that in the form. And what this means is you know, you can overlay these to create different combinations, which means there's fewer needs for exceptions and notwithstandings and all those things that require you to jump around in a document to figure out what you can do. So the first of these, of course, is the lot zoning section of the document. It's pretty straightforward. We've created 4 different lot zones. The first primarily applies to Old Town. The second primarily applies to New Town. The third primarily applies to areas outside of those. And the fourth is a very flexible one for things like parks or maybe industrial uses, where, you know, the lot that you have is not necessarily a traditional rectangle and all of that kind of stuff, where your needs might be a little different. What's interesting, or what's new here particularly, is within lot zone 1, which is Old Town primarily, not only are there, you know, the traditional minimum lot area and lot frontage, that's the amount of road frontage that you have, there's also maximums. And the idea here is to, you know, part of what makes Old Town special particularly is that really fine-grained, small lots, very dense development. So by having maximums, you know, discouraging, quote unquote, block busting, where someone buys up a whole block and consolidates it into one big building or something like that. So there's, I don't expect you to look at this in detail. It's on the Project Lunenburg website, but there, for example, is the lot zoning map, and you can see the rough general areas there. And that tells you what you need to subdivide. Also related to lot zones and subdivision, we have infrastructure. So some highlights of this is that the documents require development to connect to sewer services where it's available and water services where they're available. You know, and these are assets, these facilities, but they're also, you know, a major cost burden, and we want to use them where we have them and spread that responsibility over as many people as possible. The documents prohibit new private roads, so existing ones, if you're on one already, you can still develop on it, but new private roads wouldn't be allowed to be created under the new documents. And we also implement new road standards for the creation of new public roads. Stefan, you want to talk about this?
Sure. So as part of the subdivision bylaw, the town of Lunenburg currently has road standards for cross sections, and we're proposing a pretty significant change here, and that has to do with trying to emulate the character of the older parts of Lunenburg in potential new subdivisions and new development. So what has happened, and this is not unique to Lunenburg, really since the dawn of the automobile, we've been concerned about moving cars and making roads wider, making right-of-ways wider, and really losing the ability to build dense developments, such as on what you see in the old town, the residential parts of old towns. This example here of Cornwallis Street. So what we are proposing is to include a new road standard with a very narrow right-of-way by today's standards of 13 meters, and then the 3-meter travel lanes. So this is the absolute minimum you can go down to according to the Transportation Association of Canada, and a sidewalk on one side. And then essentially with the 13-meter right-of-way, you'll be able to build very close to the street. And we should clarify as well, this is not a requirement, this is an option. So if a developer wishes to build neighborhoods similar to the upper parts of Old Town, for example, this new standard enables them to do that, and we think it's attractive to people. Usually, developers build infrastructure, and the less infrastructure they have to build in terms of road widths, the less right-of-way gets subtracted from their overall land, the more feasible it becomes to build this infrastructure.
Another part of the subdivision process is parks and open space dedication. So when there's a subdivision of land, the Municipal Government Act allows municipalities to require the dedication of land for public purposes. That's how we get our parks and our open spaces that that new communities need. The default in the MGA, Municipal Government Act, is 5%, but you're allowed to require up to 10 if you give good reasons for it. So we are, through these documents, suggesting that we require the 10% and that we prioritize. So there's an option from the Municipal Government Act of either giving land, like physical land, or giving cash in lieu of that land that the municipality then has to use for parks and public purposes, whether acquiring new land elsewhere where it's needed or reinvesting in existing facilities. So we're requiring the 10% and kind of having a ranked system here. So if there's a subdivision along the coast, the first choice is to take land that provides public access to the coast. That's a huge issue in Nova Scotia. It came up again in Lunenburg. We don't want to lose that access, so that is our first choice to preserve that. Second choice is in areas where we have existing parks. We'd be prioritizing cash to reinvest in those rather than necessarily having an overabundance of parks. I don't know if you can ever have too many, but it does take resources, and you don't want to spread them too thin. So we prioritize cash in those areas, and then in the new areas where there aren't existing parks, particularly the western southern areas of town, we'd be looking for usable land for park purposes. Which brings me to land use. So that was lots and subdivision. The next layer, I suppose, is land use and the types of things you're allowed to do on the land. Excuse me. So we have a series of land use zones, ranging from residential to different commercial uses, a couple of industrial use zones, rural, institutional, parks and recreation. And again, these are all, you go to the back of the land use bylaw and there's a use zoning map, and you can look up your property and say, what types of things am I allowed to do on my property? And then within the land use bylaw, there's a huge set of tables that basically, for example, if I live in the residential lower density zone, use zone, I look and I say, oh, I'm permitted to have an accessory dwelling. I'm permitted to have a bed and breakfast. I'm permitted to have a dwelling with up to 2 units. Oh, but I can't have a nursing home. I'd have to go into the residential higher density use zone to have a nursing home. One thing I do want to highlight on this table is accessory dwellings. So this is a new thing that we've added. And accessory dwellings is a catch-all category that we've created to include, you might call them secondary suites, backyard suites, granny flats, in-law suites, carriage houses, basically, accessory dwellings. And a key factor here, or a key thing to highlight, is that they can either be in a detached building, or they can be within the existing main building. And one of the reasons to differentiate this from dwelling units, main dwelling units, is that there are building code allowances that make it easier to do an accessory dwelling. There's reduced standards for them. So what all of this means in the end is you actually get a third dwelling unit potentially on a lot. There are some standards for size and all that kind of thing through the accessory dwelling. So that's in the low, and then, for example, in the residential medium, you can have 4 main dwellings plus an accessory, which actually get you 5. So there's a fair bit of extra potential for residential density as a result of this, and kind of what we like to say gentle density, where maybe it's a little less visible and a little less impact on the neighborhood. Yeah. So again, there's a table for institutional uses. I don't think there's anything huge to highlight here. And a huge table for commercial uses. What do I need to, I don't know if there's anything specific to highlight here. One is electrical vehicle charging. Now that's a distinct, well, it's something that wasn't around in 2012 really when the last bylaw was done. So now we recognize that it is a use. And I should point out that these use tables are for main uses. So there's a concept in planning of main use. That's the primary purpose, that you're using the land for. But you can also have accessory uses. So, if you had even a restaurant, you might have an accessory office that the manager lives in, and that's included within that, understanding of restaurants being permitted. But if you're having offices as a standalone use, as a main use, then it has to be permitted. And why I flag that here is, so we have electrical vehicle charging commercial, that's as a main use, but there are allowances in the documents for accessory charging for things like, a hotel could have charging for its clients, or obviously people can have it as an accessory use on their own private land to charge their car. One thing to flag here is, this came up a lot in the CCP discussions with short-term rentals. So this category is, the Airbnbs, the VRBOs, basically renting out a dwelling for less than 30 days at a time. So this doesn't include accommodations. So, if this is the rental of a dwelling, if you're renting it as a guest house or a inn or whatever it may be, that would fall under accommodations. The short-term rentals are limited to one per lot through the land use bylaw. This is, one of the main tools we have from a zoning point of view to control these types of things. There are other potential tools that came up, in the CCP, things like requiring they be in primary residences or a cap on the number of nights per year or whatever. Those aren't necessarily things that are easy to do through a land use bylaw. So, we've kind of taken the first step here with the land use bylaw, but the CCP has other actions. The comprehensive community plan has other actions related to other aspects of regulating short-term rentals. Industrial, you see one thing here in this table is a different category, DA, that stands for development agreement. So what that means is this use would only be permitted if the applicant went through a process known as a development agreement. It's a semi-negotiated process with the town. There's policy in the plan that council uses to evaluate these. And then what you get is a contract that gets registered on the property and is basically almost like a mini zone, with standards and requirements for that proposal. And looking at this table, you might notice that we've moved largely away from development agreements through these drafts, looking to control a lot of the aspects of development through things like the form zones and all of that, and removing some of that quite extensive process that comes with a development agreement, time consuming, resource consuming, and trying to be more consistent, having similar rules for everybody, rather than going through a negotiated process for each site. Then we have a table for other uses. One of the new categories we have, solar collector systems, large. So again, there's clear allowances in the documents for accessory solar, and clear rules for those. And then also here in the table, allowances for solar collector as a main use in the industrial zone and the rural zone. So, that would be like a business setting up some solar panels to feed back into the grid as a main use of the land, rather than necessarily someone putting them on their roof to power their house. We have a category here of urban agriculture, which is, allows things like community gardens, also allows the keeping of, I think it's up to 5 chickens. No, it depends on lot size. There's a 1,000 square meter threshold for 5 chickens, and then above that 10 chickens. And so, basic requirements on housing and that kind of thing for the chickens. Water access is things like docks and wharves and boat ramps. So as I was mentioning, there's accessory uses that are implicit within the main use. Again, a manager's office is accessory to a restaurant or whatever it may be. But then we've also made specific, calling out of accessory uses that we're saying, yes, these can be accessory to anything. So EV charging for the use of occupants, accessory solar again, accessory wind turbines. These are small scale, again, for on-site generation, and things like residential storage buildings on adjacent lots. Also, in relation to land use, it's pretty typical in land use bylaws to regulate or to require minimum numbers of parking spots for each type of use. A restaurant might require 1 spot for every 300 square feet of floor area or whatever it may be. We have done away with that in these drafts. And that's kind of a movement that you're seeing more and more in municipalities around North America. We got to the, we actually put together a whole table of parking minimums for these draft documents. And then as we started to look at the exceptions of them, you don't want to make requirements in the Old Town area, because if you're telling people they have to fit 10 spots on their lot or they can't have their business, you're encouraging them to tear down buildings, basically, which, you know, so that was already an exception. Residential uses tend to have more than enough space on the lot, and it's something that residents demand. So there's already an incentive there to provide it. And then, you know, so the one area where you might want to require parking is in the commercial area on Victoria Road, but those lots are all quite large. You know, there's not a trade-off to be made there from a developer's point of view between parking and larger floor area space. So we've taken a bit, I think, a bit of a progressive step here and actually eliminated minimum automobile parking requirements. In addition to that, we have also added minimum bicycle parking requirements. You know, this is something that not everyone thinks of when they're establishing a business or building a apartment building or whatever it may be. And we're seeing more and more demand for bike tourism is one part of it. It's a growing thing in the province with things like the Blue Route and you know, people looking to get active. But we're also seeing more and more use of cycling for utilitarian purposes, to run and get groceries or bike your kid to school or whatever it may be. And especially with e-bikes, you know, we now have a rebate in the province. It's easier for everyone to do. And you want a place to lock up these expensive e-bikes and touring bikes and all that kind of thing. So non-conforming uses. So those are uses, you know, people legally established at one point, whether before planning existed or under an old planning document, and then zoning got changed, and you know, that use wouldn't necessarily be permitted today. But people have made investments in them. You can't, you know, just want to go and say, hey, we changed the rules, please shut down. You want to recognize that, and very often established businesses, you know, or people know they're there and they moved in with that knowledge, and it's an accepted part of the community. You just wouldn't necessarily, you know, maybe want a new different business to move in next door or in a residential area or whatever it may be. So the Municipal Government Act provides protections for these non-conforming uses. But if you discontinue them for more than 6 months, that's it, you can't start up again. In Nova Scotia, we tend to move a little slower, I find. And people have a, you know, longer acceptance, a longer memory. So if something's closed for 6 months and it wants to come back, you know, people kind of expect that. So the documents expand that time period to 12 months to give a little more leeway there. And there's also a provision in there to allow expansion or conversion of a non-conforming use by development agreement. So again, you know, there's a situation where, yeah, maybe it might make sense to change that bar to a restaurant, even though the restaurant would be also against the zoning. But it could be argued that, for example, that the restaurant wouldn't be less impact on the neighborhood in terms of noise and later hours and all that kind of thing. So there's a mechanism there by development agreement to say, yeah, we think this is going to be less impact. We're okay with putting another non-conforming use as long as it lessens the impact. So that's uses. Stefan, you want to chat form?
Sure. Thanks, Ian. Just should quickly mention, if we haven't done it already, people are starting to type in questions, and we're going to answer all of them at the end. So we're not ignoring you. We're just going to park them till the end of the presentation. Yes, so the form zone is really an idea that originated in our analysis of the historic growth of Lunenburg. And for those of you who were part of the comprehensive community plan consultations, you may remember that we took a pretty deep dive in the development history of Lunenburg. And essentially, Ian, if you could forward. What we're trying to do with our form zones is to regulate building forms. So that is setbacks, heights, lot coverage, generally the massing of buildings, as well as a few details like the Lunenburg bump and decks and structures and such, in a way where again we take clues from the past. So we here as an example here 4 diagrams showing zones that you will now find in the new land use bylaw draft. One is called the Old Town 1, which is essentially the old business district with buildings often taking up entire lots. They're built up to the street right of way, and can go up to 3 stories in height. And then as we move up the hill into the kind of residential parts, we looked at the development pattern there and kind of defined that as a new zone that we call Old Town 2. And then as we move, as Lunenburg grew into the new town, setbacks get larger. Again, building types change, and progressively over time, as lots got bigger, we move further west in the new town. There's, for example, a zone that we now call Old Town, New Town 2. So those, if you want to advance the slide in, those, this analysis resulted in these zones. So most of them are residential. What is really, and essentially there are no big changes to what you can build as a main dwelling in terms of its size and shape in the established parts of Lunenburg. We have, however, established a few new zones with some interesting changes, we think, and they also relate back to the comprehensive community plan. You may remember that we talked about Victoria Road over time evolving into more of a main street, so away from the kind of car-oriented single-use, one-story commercial buildings to something that resembles more of a main street. So buildings closer to the street, multi-stories with ground floor retail or services. So that would be the Main Street zone. And then, yeah, there's the map. So essentially, for example, that Victoria Road area, you see that pink area that Ian's pointing out right now, would essentially what we're trying to do with the land use bylaw is incentivize that transition by allowing more what we call upzoning, essentially allowing more density and more return on a development. And so what is part of the form chapter of the land use bylaw are also these setbacks. Again, the older residential parts, all the essentially anything from Old Town 1 down to New Town 1, those setbacks are consistent with what is existing now in Lunenburg. What we've done is, what is new is added some minimum setbacks. Where is that now? Sorry, maximum setbacks, excuse me. So essentially to disallow buildings really be set back far from the street, contrary to what the surrounding development character is. And next slide, please. These are accessory building placements. So this is, not just your accessory building as it is currently allowed, like garages and sheds and such, but also what Ian mentioned, accessory dwellings. So allowing a second residential unit in your backyard as a granny suite. So that would apply to, or a backyard suite, those setbacks would apply as well. And in order, again, to allow this intensification of the established residential areas through this, what we call gentle density, we've increased the maximum lot coverage quite significantly. So we ran an analysis of what the current lot coverage and bumped that up to, so the Old Town 2 and the other residential areas from between 40 and 50%. So really to allow you to build that that secondary dwelling if you want to. And in the main street, it is, again, we're trying to maximize people building out their lots for these multi-unit buildings, and all the other, the marine industry rule lot coverages, nothing has changed there. So next slide. Maximum building heights, again, they reference in the established areas what you already have as a maximum height. So Old Town 1 is like a 3-story building. We did include a minimum height in the Old Town, so in the central business district, and that's essentially to disallow your 1-story, you know, let's say dollar store development that you would have seen in the past. We want to essentially guarantee that people at least built a 2-story building and contribute to the character of that Old Town area. And then the other bigger change is in the Main Street zone. We now allow 20-story buildings, and there's a few other parameters. Again, we pardon me?
Not 20 stories, 20 meters.
Oh, 20 meters. Excuse me. Oh, out come the pitchforks. But we also have a minimum height. So again, trying to get away from the 1-story typical car-oriented commercial building. So essentially, and you see this in other parts of the country now, that even these larger footprint stores, they coexist with residential development above. So you see now Sobeys and other traditional big box stores essentially being housed in what is a residential development above them, a multi-unit building. We also have a minimum ground floor height, so that's just allows for a comfortable environment in that retail ground floor that is quite typical in contemporary land use bylaws. And then a minimum street wall height, and that essentially is a way to have a certain sense of enclosure on your main street. So you want essentially, in this case, a 3-story street wall. So the building next to your sidewalk goes up by 3 stories. And then we have a minimum step back, that is the 3 meters there. And what that does is all the floors above 3 stories get set back, and you actually don't experience them as a pedestrian when you're on the street. So the actual height of the building is kind of disguised from you as the pedestrian. And other than that, in the marine and community industry zones, nothing has changed there. We can advance that slide, please.
We did increase the height in the marine zone. That
Right. Yes. So accessory building massing, those you're now allowed to build up to 8 meters for those additional buildings in your backyard. And then a new development form that is already, there are groups in Lunenburg that are already pursuing this idea, and you see them in Wolfville and other places. These are called group dwellings. And what is new here is that you're allowed to build more than one residential use on a lot. You're actually allowed to build multiple buildings. What the idea behind this is that this is a development that allows aging in place. So as older folks want to move out of their big houses that they don't want to upkeep, spend the effort and the money on, they're looking for something a more communal, smaller home, potentially with shared care services, a shared community building, and a very kind of comfortable communal way to age and remain in the community rather than having to move out of Lunenburg. So those now would be allowed in this draft in a few of the residential zones and the Main Street zone as well.
It also accommodates things, for example, if anyone's familiar with the Treehouse Village in Bridgewater, for example, it's not necessarily a seniors community. It's a bare land condominium, or where people own their units, but they're all on one lot as a condo, or you could also be used to accommodate things like co-housing. It's basically a form of development that allows some flexibility in unique housing structures, I would say. Another aspect of the form regulations is, we are in a time of climate change. Nova Scotia is also sinking from post-glacial rebound. The landmass is actually sinking in addition to the seas rising. And we expect, kind of over the next 80 years, about a meter of sea level rise. All the modeling shows. And so when you add that to a, kind of major storm, a Hurricane Dorian or Hurricane Juan or something, there's some, pretty big risk there for flooding of areas that didn't used to flood. So we have, in the land use bylaw, there's a map, flood risk area map that kind of, that identifies lands that would be at risk of a being flooded by a major storm in conjunction with sea level rise. And so developments in those areas are required, will be required to have the finished floor of the elevation of finished floor for habitable areas. So, that's where people can live, no lower than 3.2 meters above the Canadian Geodetic Vertical Datum of 2013, which is basically a computer model of the Earth's surface is the current reference point for that surveyors use. It's hard to translate that into a number that we are, that you and I experience every day, or a reference point, but it's basically accommodating a meter of sea level rise. So, the idea here is that, no one will be living necessarily in the area that will be flooded. And so what this does allow is, you could still have developments in these areas, but any residential areas, development's going to have to be above that elevation, maybe on the second floor or whatever it is. They're not going to get flooded. Another aspect of this requirements is that hazardous materials and potential pollutants, such as fuel oil, have to be either not below that elevation, or they have to be designed for safety and containment in the event of a flood. And finally, the consideration has to be given to the placement of flood vulnerable equipment. So, you wouldn't necessarily put the electrical room below that elevation where it could get flooded and create a danger and be damaged. So there's the flood risk area map. You know, a big part of form and what that often comes up is signage. It's kind of essential for businesses. It's also a big part of the aesthetics of the community, and also having effective signage depends on, you know, kind of not having signage compete with each other and all that kind of stuff. So we mostly kept what's in the existing planning documents for signage, though we have reduced the minimum height for projecting signs to make them a little easier to put in while still being safe. We've simplified the language and reorganized the section, and then recognizing, you know, that there's more and more call for like digital signs and menu board signs, that these documents now address those. You want to touch that one, Stefan?
Yes, 1 second here. So those are some new standards for larger parking lots, and that's essentially to prevent the kind of large expanses of asphalt that you know, we used to build, and new developments tend to break those up into landscape bays. We do limit the parking in the front and flankage yards to 3 parking spaces. And there's also a requirement for electrical vehicle charging stations in structured parking.
That's parking garages and underground parking.
Mm-hmm.
So just like non-conforming uses, you can also have a non-conforming structure. So this would be, you know, for example, a building, again, that was built either before there was planning rules or under an old bylaw, and the rules have since changed. You know, maybe the minimum setback got increased, and the building is, you know, too far forward under the current rules. Again, we're not going by and saying, hey, we changed the rules on you, you have to tear that house down. That just simply wouldn't be reasonable. So you can have a non-conforming structure. The Municipal Government Act, again, provides protections for these. One of the things we've made clear in the documents is that you can expand non-conforming structures as long as the expansion doesn't increase the non-conformity. So for example, if my house is too close to the front lot line, I can still put an addition at the back as long as it meets all the other requirements of the bylaw, because it's not making that front lot line issue any worse. I don't expect we'll have too many of these, to be honest. You know, again, we have fairly flexible form rules. We want to encourage buildings close to the street and all that kind of thing. So, but those protections are there for when they do happen. Another aspect of form is, you know, heritage and architectural control. There's no changes at this time from the current approach. The town has initiated a project to review the Heritage Conservation District and the architectural controls. But you know, the priority was getting these documents done. And so as these documents, you know, move towards adoption and this project winds down a little bit, that Heritage Conservation District project will ramp up. And the idea is that we'll come back and amend the sections of these documents, you know, delete the sections and replace them with whatever comes out of that Heritage Conservation District review. So for now, status quo, but expect to see some modifications in the future. We've also, you know, taken an opportunity to update definitions, make them clearer as possible, make sure there's definitions for everything, and in some cases, put in supporting illustrations to hopefully make it a little easier to understand. So, you know, there's an example of a flag lot. Okay, so that is the Coles notes. of what these new documents do and contain. Obviously, there's lots more detail that would take us all night into the morning to go through, I'm sure. But we're going to take questions in a few minutes and be happy to take those questions. And also, if you want to email us later or talk to Dawn about a particular property or whatever it may be, you know, how it may affect you specifically, we're happy to do that. So we presented the drafts back, I think on the 13th. They've been live since the 8th. And there's been we received a lot of really good comments from people, suggestions, concerns, questions. And so we've gone back and edited the documents in response in many cases. So the new drafts that are up on the Project Lunenburg web pages, they show track changes. Some changes, you know, some comments we didn't make changes as a result. Partly, you know, some of them are, again, I mentioned at the start, are things that are addressed with other tools through the CCP, the Comprehensive Community Plan, and not necessarily through the Land Use Bylaw and Municipal Planning Strategy Subdivision Bylaw. But certainly we've done our best to respond to those comments. So in general, correcting a lot of typos and errors. These documents are drafts until they're not. So we're always finding things to fix. We started to add imperial conversions into the document for your convenience, for everybody who still works in feet. Metric is the official unit of the documents, and whenever we've had to round, it's worse for imperial to avoid, you know, the risk that someone only looks at the imperial and breaks the official rule. So if you're really pushing the limit, if you really want to build down to that last centimeter, make sure you're working in metric. We haven't finished that. We didn't get them all done before getting these drafts out to you. Thought it was more important to have them in your hands than have all the units in there, but we'll keep working on those. We have added farmers markets and offices as uses permitted in the waterfront use zone. And we've added workshops as a main use permitted in the marine industrial use zone. We've added clarity that accessory dwellings can be in an accessory building or within the main building. So again, you know, between that and the 2 or 4 units that are permitted in the low and medium residential use zone, you can have 3 or 5 units total, which, you know, allows for some residential intensification, reuse of existing dwellings, all that kind of thing. We've added text to the land use bylaw on obnoxious uses. There's a slight tweaking on minimum building heights in the Old Town 1 and Main Street form zones to allow a little more range in there and a little more flexibility on the sites. We've reorganized Schedule A, which is the list of existing uses, to make it easier to use. We've corrected a boundary on the Heritage Conservation District map at the top of Kemp Street. It's a change that hasn't yet gone to council yet, so we've reverted back to the existing boundary there, pending that. There's some adjustments to the future land use map to reflect some parks that got missed. Also, some areas, for example, Shipyard Hill, which is zoned industrial, but you know, if there's a desire ever in the future to go residential, it makes that easier. A couple other places where, you know, they're zoned one thing but are now in a commercial future land use designation that would allow a change to commercial use in the future. Some tweaks to the use zoning map along Green Street and Tannery Road, kind of that interface between, you know, the Main Street use zone, or the commercial mixed use zone where the Main Street is on Victoria Road, and transitioning into the older parts of town. There was a couple corrections to the form zoning map on Falkland Street. We had put a couple properties in the wrong form, and then one on Tannery Road that, again, we had changed the use but accidentally hadn't updated the form zoning, so we fixed those. We've added a fair bit of extra text to the municipal planning strategy related to housing. highlighting some of the other issues around housing. Again, recognizing, I should have said this back at the start, but as far as municipal planning strategies go, this one's fairly light in terms of the amount of text and its length. Again, recognizing that Lunenburg's in the unique position of having this comprehensive community plan that can take on some of that burden, I think, of, not burden, but some of that, shoulder the task of providing the context and having additional information on these topics. But housing was one where, fair enough, we were fairly light. So we added a lot more related to that. Similarly, we added some text regarding marinas and recreational uses in the waterfront use zone, just to emphasize that those are permitted there. And added clarifying text to where institutional use zones were placed. There was concern that there wasn't an institutional use zone on every institutional use, and just wanted to provide some context in the plan as to why that was the case. So I think those are the major changes. As Don outlined at the start of the meeting, the intention is to have a second public information meeting. I think Planning Advisory Committee has to vote on that later tonight, but on June 2nd, and then Planning Advisory Committee will be in a position to make a recommendation on the documents to Council on June 2nd. If all this holds, if the schedule holds, we'd have a first reading on June 22nd, public hearing and second reading potentially on July 27th, and then, as Don mentioned, that has to go to the province for review against the Provincial Statements of Interest and the Municipal Government Act. We don't foresee any issues there, but you never know. And knock on wood, we'd have new planning documents once that's done and it's advertised in the local paper as being in effect. So that is our presentation. I see we have questions. Don, do we go right into that, or is there anything procedurally we have to do right now?
Through the chair, you can go right into that, Ian.
So the first question is, could an accessory use for a marina be a restaurant? Yeah, I think that would be a reasonable interpretation. That's a really good example of a case where you'd have an accessory use. Marinas often have a restaurant or a lounge or something in them. And that's exactly how accessory uses are used. The next one is, could you address home-based businesses on commercial uses? So there is let me zoom right back. Go back to the use zones. Oops, oh no, I don't know. I clicked way too many tabs. So there is a use category, home-based business, and you can see it's permitted in basically any zone that allows residential uses. There are caps on the size. I can't remember. Stefan, do you want to go to the next one, and I'll come right back with my.
I can't move the slides. I'm sorry.
Oh, you can't move the slide. Okay. Just a second. Let me. Or if I switch screens, does it stop sharing this one? I can't remember. This. You're still looking at my PowerPoint slide? Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah, so there are requirements for a home-based business. It has to be the place of primary residence of the owner. It has to be located in the dwelling or an accessory building. It allows offices, craft workshops, personal service shops, so that's things like hairdressers and stuff, tailoring and dressmaking, studios for the practice and instruction of fine arts, commercial arts or crafts, repair shops, excluding vehicle or small engine repair shops, daycare centers, taxi cab operations, and on-site preparation of food for off-site. So basically catering. You can have multiple of those uses in one home-based business as long as they don't exceed the total size. You can have retail sales related to the business. So, if you're a hairdresser, you can sell shampoo. The area is 25% of the gross floor area of the dwelling, or 47 square meters, 505 square feet, whichever is less. That is home businesses. Hacks and trolleys as a commercial use. So, yeah, so there's one where, because that occurs within the public right of way, it's not a land use for which you'd, it's not the primary use of land for which you'd get a permit, a development permit. There's a case where it would, I believe it falls under the vending bylaw through the chair to Dawn.
There's a hack and trolley bylaw.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the bylaw, or the land use bylaw, doesn't prohibit it or enable it one way or another, because it's not a primary use of land for which you get a development permit.
Okay, there's a question about, the question goes, in your infrastructure slide, your 13-meter proposed lane width doesn't account for parking on a street of this width. Are you proposing no parking options for these roads? So that's a really good question. It is tight. Should clarify, we're talking about a 13-meter right-of-way. So the lane widths would be 3 meters each, so 6 altogether. So the 13-meter right-of-way is consistent in the residential old town. What you, if you're familiar with the area, what you'll find is that the lane widths vary quite a bit, and on the tighter areas there is indeed no on-street parking, so people would park in their driveways. What you also see, and you could enable through signage, is parking on one street, but not continuously on the street, but only in certain pockets. So you get this kind of weaving around. If two cars meet in opposite direction, you have to wait for the other one to pass. And so it is that would be the idea. I should also clarify that this is not a maximum pavement width. So if the developer decides, we want really proper parking one side of the street, you can build your width of pavement out to 7 meters or 7.5 meters. And
the next question is related to minimum bicycle parking requirements. So, how would an owner of a commercial building with a 0-foot frontage and full width building provide bike parking on the lot? Would it be on the sidewalk? So, nope. So yeah, again, we're hitting the highlights here, the high points pieces, but it's a good question. So first of all, there's a number of requirements for bicycle parking, things like they have to have a rack. There's basic standards for that, the space around, the size of the space to ensure good access. There's also within the land use bylaw an exemption from these requirements within the area of the Heritage Conservation District. So that's basically a lot of downtown old zone, recognizing again that these are, like you point out, a lot of those buildings have 0-foot frontage. They might be the full width. They don't have the space. We certainly encourage people to find ways of doing it, but we're not going to require it there. Next question is that the town owns some laneways that are unofficial roads. For example, the lane off of Star Street. How will new zoning for lots abutting these lanes be treated going forward? I don't know if I'm super familiar with that specific one, but basically we're not allowing the creation of any new private roads. but any existing ones, they are what they are. And there's nothing in the bylaw that would prevent development on them. I don't think. No, there shouldn't be.
We'll check into that.
Yeah, I'll check that one.
Yeah.
Come back to that.
Ian, it's Dawn. Some of those, I know the one that they're speaking of. It's not. It's a road right away, but it's not maintained.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. That's yeah.
Right. It's town owned. I see. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's a right away.
So the next question is, why not allow marine industrial form zone to go to 20.5 meter high? Why is Main Street so high? So this is when we get into the form zones. So 19.5 meters. So we see it here. That's 6 stories roughly. And the reason for that 6 stories in the marine is to accommodate, marine industrial needs, things like accommodating large boat and boat sheds and that kind of thing. In the residential area, 6 stories is, it's a, kind of mid-rise style that creates comfortable main streets without being too big. It's also aligns with, there's new building code in Canada that allows 6-story wood construction, which was supposed to be a way of having affordable housing. I think these days everybody's pouring concrete. But so it does, align with that building code. The reason why Main Street is 1 meter higher is because we have that minimum ground floor height that basically requires that extra 1 meter on the ground floor. And we don't want people to lose a floor just because of that. So it bumps the ground floor up, but still has that overall what equates to basically 6-story height.
So Blockhouse Hill, please address development restrictions for what is Blockhouse Hill.
So we'll go up to the use zone first. Well, I guess here's a good test of going through the document. You can see how you would use it if you're looking at development. So Blockhouse Hill is in lot zone 2. So that's the, oops, what happened there? It's the lot zone that's modeled on Newtown. So there are minimum lot sizes and frontages that align with that lot zone. So anyone creating, subdividing in there would have to meet those standards at a minimum. Then it's in a, it's split zoned with residential medium density use zone on the upper portions, and the lower portions, which is basically aligns with kind of 2 traditional block depths there to allow continuation of the grid. Below that, down the hill, would be the residential higher density zone, use zone. So on the upper portions, you could have up to 4 dwellings plus an accessory, so 5 per lot basically. And the lower you could do multi-unit buildings and that kind of thing. And then you get into the form zones. So in this case, we have the Old Town, New Town 1 form zone on there, which when you look at things, so there's no minimum front or flankage setback, but there is a maximum. There's requirements for side setbacks. There's a maximum lot coverage of 40%, maximum height of 10.5 meters, which is that roughly that's 3 stories, 3.5 stories, and that's basically what shapes the development in this area. So the next question is, would a building in the flood areas still adhere to the same building height restrictions, or would there be an allowance to bring it up to Canadian flooding level? So the way height is measured in the bylaw is from average grade. So one strategy in these areas to avoid the flood restrictions is to raise the average grade on the site through infill, to build the elevation up high enough that it's above that elevation. And then the building height would be measured from that new grade. You got to be careful with that a little bit, that it's done well. I've seen situations where people have kind of built up and then that basically just the water goes to their neighbors, sort of thing. So there's a duty there, I think, to consider impacts on neighboring uses, but certainly building up the land is one strategy for avoiding that flood risk. If you're high enough, you're out of the flood risk.
Don, this next question, would you be able to answer that?
Or I can, if you want.
Sure.
Yeah. So the next question is, could you please clarify the timeline as it pertains to a proposed development project that slips in prior to Project Lunenburg coming into effect? If it does not conform to the new rules, would it be permitted? Do they get reconsidered? Do permits travel with the land if the property is sold? So yeah, for right now, the rules that are in effect are the current planning documents, the 2012 planning documents. Project Lunenburg, for all intents and purposes, does not exist from Don's point of view in giving a permit. Anybody that came in the door today would be under those old rules. And you get your permit, and your development permit is good for 18 months, Don? 12 months? What are your
It's a year here.
Yeah,
It's a
12
year.
months. So if you're in before and you got your permit, you'd be under their old rules, and that the permit's the permit. In the Municipal Government Act, there is a rule, or there is a, I guess, procedural thing where once new planning documents have been given first reading and notice of intent to adopt, so basically advertising the public hearing has been made, both sets of planning documents apply. So there's a funny little window where it's actually kind of hard to get development because you got to meet both rules. So there's, once you do that, you want to go through it fairly fast. So yeah, kind of that first reading and notification of intent to adopt is kind of the cutoff.
But I need to clarify that that's for a development permit.
Yeah.
It's not for something that's under the old rules for a development agreement, which is like a contract. So that's different.
Yeah. So any development agreement that's already been adopted and or that's already been signed and registered on title, that's there. A lot of development agreements have expiry periods attached to them, and at someday they will expire if they haven't been acted upon. But it's basically, again, a contract, as Don said. We do have policy in the new draft municipal planning strategy to address old development agreements, because sometimes people come in for amendments and you've got a new plan, and the policy that the development agreement was considered under originally is no longer there. So what the new municipal planning strategy says is that basically non-substantive amendments, those tend to be fairly minor, and what that means is outlined in each different development agreement. What's considered non-substantive, they're considered, they're minor, council can consider them, but substantive amendments, major changes, would only be considered if they were enabled and met the policy of today, or not today, of the new municipal planning strategy once it's adopted, if that makes sense.
So the next question is related to bonus zoning as a tool to incentivize affordable housing. So that is essentially creates incentives by adding development rights to a property. So giving you the ability to, develop another additional story on a building in exchange for you as a developer providing affordable housing in your building. And as something that we see in larger centers, we have not included it in this bylaw.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's a relatively, HRM's had the power to do that for a while, and they've been using it as a tool and sorting out the kinks in it. I think it hasn't been an easy process to make it work well. It's a tool that's relatively, last 2 years or less, available to municipalities outside of HRM, and everybody's kind of figuring out how to use it. But at this point, yeah, we have chosen not to do that yet. There's a comment there. We'll look at that. Next one is, does the Old Town 1 minimum 6-meter height requirement intend to support second stories or just have a taller facade? 6 meters could go either way. I suppose there isn't anything in there that says it has to be a second story, a second floor, an actual second floor. You could build a false wall, I suppose. It would still achieve the effective, aesthetics from the street. I don't know if it's ideal, but you want to add to that, Stefan?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the question.
Well, we have the minimum height of 6 meters in here, and I guess the question is, do you actually have to build a whole second floor, or could you just have a really tall facade with 1 floor behind?
Yeah, I guess that's we see that in historic buildings with false facades, but wouldn't.
Yeah.
It's not the intent. Next question related to view planes. Are view planes considered with your partitioning of new areas? So for the blockhouse area, it would appear that view planes for the upper, less dense area could be blocked by the denser lower area. So really good question, because you probably have seen view plane maps in Lunenburg planning documents, and those are related to the heritage plan and bylaw, and those are being reviewed as a future project on next implementation step of Project Lunenburg. And it is an interesting situation with Blockhouse Hill as the heritage district kind of covers the top of Blockhouse Hill currently, and it will be part of the heritage plan review to determine which views should either continue to be protected, should be potentially erased from the plan, or which new views should be created. So but it's currently not part of this land use bylaw.
I think the other thing too, there's a really good example of use versus form. So, if we go back to those maps again, the use map had higher density residential, but that's density in terms of units. So, the lower area of the hill is higher density residential, and so you could have buildings that had more than 4 residential units in them, apartment style buildings or condominiums or whatever they are. But in the form zone, it's still all in that old town, new town 1 form zone, which has a maximum height of what was it, 10.5 meters. So, you know, when we're talking higher density residential here, we're not necessarily talking big, tall buildings, which, you know, so we can kind of control that again in terms of shaping the form separately from the use. Final question that we have now, and if you have more, start throwing them in, but this one says the bylaw states that short-term rentals shall not be permitted in accessory dwellings or accessory buildings. I assume this is related to tourism bookings, which is fine. Can we separate tourism accommodation from working populations? What about allowing for short-term contracted workers or students in short-term programs? Is there a way to register a property so that would be allowable? It's really difficult, to be fair, or to be honest. It is quite challenging to regulate based on who's, you know, the who. So right now, a short-term rental is defined as anything less than 30 days. And let me just check the definition to be exactly precise here. Give me a second. RS short school shipping container means the use of a dwelling or part thereof for commercial overnight accommodations for consecutive periods of 30 days or less per party, and may include the rental of the entire dwelling unit to one party or to multiple parties. So I think that's the commercial aspect of that is kind of the one place where we can differentiate from a land use point of view. So in that case, you know, for example, if it was an employer providing short-term housing to their staff, I would argue that doesn't fall under a commercial operation. We'll give some thinking about the wording. Again, it is a challenging one, but I can think about that. That's all the open questions. Anything further?
We do have one hand up from the attendees. Although we don't have a name, so.
What's the procedure for answering hands?
So if Susan is with us as the chair, she would chair the debate or the information session.
So right now I have Nancy Sixsmith who would like to ask a question. Go ahead, Nancy. You're on mute.
Sorry, I raised my hand in error.
That's okay. I don't see any other hands raised.
There is another question in the chat, Madam Chair.
So the question in the chat, they're asking about the film industry who has been here for 2 months. I'm not sure what the question is.
So through the chair, I assume this is in relation to short-term rentals. So yeah, in this case, again, that would be greater than 30 days. So it wouldn't be an issue there, but yeah, if it was even, you know, a short film that was for less time than that, we'll have to understand the concern there. So yeah, I will give some thought to that if there's a way to differentiate those cleanly.
Thank you, Ian. Are there any other questions for Ian or Stefan in regards to the presentation? Not seeing any other hands. No one else is in the chat. I would like someone to move that we now close the public information meeting portion, and I would like to thank Stefan and Ian both for a great presentation again and answering the questions that came through from the previous presentation and giving us that update. So thank you very much. So someone would like to move we close the public information meeting? Moved by Ed, seconded by Jerry. Any further discussion? All in favor? Contrary minded? The public meeting is now closed. Moving on to 7 new business, new draft planning documents. Do I have someone who would like to move the Planning Advisory Committee host an additional public information meeting that would be on Wednesday, June the 2nd at 6 p.m. It's moved by Councillor Ernst, seconded by Derek. Thank you, Derek. Any discussion with regards to having an additional PAC meeting and public information meeting? Dawn?
Thank you, Chair Sanford. Yes, and I'd just like to tell the citizen members that thanks to the CAO yesterday, it was able to get on the council agenda, and council has also approved this as well. So we're in good shape to go forward with that next Wednesday. And we encourage anyone out there to participate again. Excuse me, the new draft documents are online, so have a look at them if you haven't, and if you see more changes, please send them to hello@projectlunenburg.ca, so Ian and Stefan can have a look at them, and they'll be coming back with even more changes and to do a brief explanation. So these documents will be revised again, hopefully not too much, but if there is some input, they will certainly take them under consideration. So next week we'll have our public information meeting, and then hopefully we'll have a recommendation from the Planning Advisory Committee to to move the documents forward to council for first reading.
Thank you, Dawn. Marissa?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dawn, just to clarify, so then that would be after the June 2nd meeting and the recommendation from PAC, the documents would be final when they go to council for public hearing. There would be no changes beyond that point unless council saw fit to order them and reboot the process.
Through the chair, yes. So PAC may have recommendations that that they want to see some changes, or they may not. At that point, it would be in the form of a motion, right? It would be, accept the draft documents with changes to, say, the ONT1 form zone to increase the height 0.5 meter. So that would be separate, and it would be in the motion. And so it'll come to you that way. We wouldn't instruct or wouldn't have Upland incorporate them at that point. If council accepted that with the changes, then Upland would come back and do that. And that's what that's how we've given them a little extra. Because there is an extra meeting to incorporate those changes.
Okay, and then council would either accept or reject those proposed amendments at first reading for recommendation to go public hearing.
That's how we envisioned it at the beginning, right?
Okay, no, that sounds good. Thank you.
Councillor Halverson?
Thanks. Through the chair, I'd just like to confirm that the changes that Stephanie noted this evening, those will be presented at the June 2nd. And will there be opportunity for public to see any of the changes prior to the June 2nd when PAC sees them for the first time?
I'll let Ian answer that if he'll have them turned around in time. They wouldn't be very major for sure.
Through the chair, so the changes that we talked about tonight are already in the documents that are on there's a new version as of last night up on projectlunenburg.ca that has the track changes with the ones we highlighted tonight. Any comments we get between now and the 2nd, my understanding is that we will make those changes, but there needs to be a time for those comments. So I would expect we'd have the new drafts with track changes up on the 1st. Does that make sense?
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other questions, discussions, comment? Jerry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at page 28 in the land use bylaw, Article 7.3, called Architectural Control Area. It seems to me this chapter has found its way into this document when it really belongs in the Heritage Conservation Bylaw. And full disclosure, I think when it gets into the Heritage Conservation Bylaw, I think it ought to be deleted altogether. So I don't understand why it's here. It has a completely different tone from the other things that we've been talking about. And it's right back into that questionable direction of trying to convince people to make fake old buildings in an architectural control area. So I think we have a lot, we have to talk about this concept for a long time yet before we're out of here, but I don't think this section belongs in this document.
Ian?
Yes, through the chair, that is basically a copy and paste from the existing land use bylaw to, I guess, avoid a gap between the time when, as I mentioned earlier in tonight's presentation, there's a project to review the Heritage Conservation District and the approach to architectural control. So for now, that section is basically plugging that gap, holding over what's in the current documents, the 2012 documents, and then the intention would be pending this review of the Heritage Conservation District and architectural control, that any necessary changes or deletions or whatever they may be would be done as an amendment.
Thank you.
Well, I think we need a vigorous debate about this, and I'm nervous about it remaining in this document.
Thank you, Jerry. Any other comments? Further discussion? Derek, go ahead.
To that point, to Jerry's point, the question is there any wording with that particular clause that relates to the fact that it's being maintained only because it's a placeholder during a document review, and that this particular clause is expected to be retired and or significantly amended at such a time as that review is approved?
Ian?
Through the chair, yeah, there is a little bit in the municipal planning strategy side of things, which provides the context and background, but we can, I'll take a look and see if we need to beef that up at all.
Thank you. Any further discussion? So we're ready to vote that we are having another public information meeting on Wednesday, June the 2nd at 6 p.m. Oh, sorry, Councillor Halverson. I was looking down reading.
That's okay, I wasn't fast enough with the dog, get my video turned on. Through you to Ian, is there, I guess, what is the danger in as Jerry pointed out, if we remove that section at this point? You said we don't want a gap. What is the danger in having that gap? Could you just maybe lay that out for us so we understand what the repercussions are?
Yeah, through the chair. So I think the thing is that, there's what hasn't been answered is the question of whether we want architectural controls at all, or to what degree we want architectural controls. And that's, to be answered through this coming process. So our default stance, I think, is to stay with what we have now until that question can be explored and answered, and then suitable direction be taken.
Arissa?
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that on a point of order, this really, I don't think is germane to the point of question. This should be a debate that happens after the close of the next public information meeting. I agree with Jerry that those being in the land use bylaw are beyond they pass my understanding, in the sense that they're more appropriate in a heritage conservation district plan and bylaw, but that's not really the motion that's on the floor at this stage. So I think that's a conversation for next week.
Okay, thank you, Marissa. So we're at the stage that we're voting on the public information meeting for Wednesday, June the 2nd. All in favor? Contrary minded? Motion carried. Our next meeting date will be June the 2nd. So we'll have the public information meeting on Wednesday at 6 o'clock. And again, we'll be looking at the planning strategy, municipal planning strategy, land use bylaw, and the subdivision bylaw with the updates. And would someone like to move the meeting be adjourned? Moved by Jerry, seconded by Ed. Meeting adjourned. Good night, guys. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.